Hello, I'm Paul Moravec, and welcome to our afternoon lecture by Terry Teachout. And he's given me actually a list of his accomplishments and current positions here. And actually I could go on, all afternoon talking about all the things he does. He's now that James Brown is no longer with us, he is the hardest working man in show business. And but anyways, I'll just read what he's given me here so I don't leave out anything important. Terry Teachout is the drama critic of the Wall Street Journal, the music critic of Commentary, and the author of Sightings, a bi-weekly column for the Saturday Journal, that is Wall Street Journal, about the arts in America. He also writes about the arts on his blog About Last Night, www.terryteachout.com. His most recent books are All in the Dances, A Brief Life of George Balanchine, A Terry Teachout Reader, and The Skeptic, A Life of H.L. Mencken. He was appointed to the National Council on the Arts in 2004. He is currently finishing Rhythm Man, and he just told me on the train down from New York, he just written another 500 words for this book. It's a biography of Louis Armstrong, coming out when? A year from now, and I'm sure it's going to be dynamite. And last but not least, the libretto for The Letter, Paul Moravec's, that's me, operatic version of Somerset Maugham's play, which will be premiered by Santa Fe Opera in 2009. So please welcome Terry Teachout.
I also give speeches. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you all and to be introduced by my esteemed and very tall collaborator and good friend. It is one of my proudest achievements as a music critic that I had the good ear and the good sense to tell the world that Paul Moravec was a major composer and that I did so a full decade before he won the Pulitzer Prize. That's like buying Google low and holding. And it happens that I met Paul in my capacity as a critic. I heard his violin sonata, liked it, wrote about it, and got curious about the man behind the piece. And now, 14 years later, we find ourselves on the same side of the fence. And when the critics review the premiere of our opera in Santa Fe next summer, we'll be taking our lumps together. I hope they turn out to be sugar lumps. Needless to say, this won't be the first time that I've been on the receiving end of criticism. I've written a number of books, some of which got good reviews and some of which, well, didn't. So I know what it feels like to open the morning paper and get both barrels in the face. And that's a good thing. Most of the time, criticism is a one-way street, and it shouldn't be. It is a good thing for critics to take their lumps in public, deserved or not, just as it's a good thing for us to admit our mistakes, even though we rarely do. I bet you weren't expecting to hear that, were you? Well, I hope to say a few more things today that might surprise you, so let's get down to business. As Paul told you a moment ago, one of my books is a biography of H.L. Mencken. That was the one that got the good reviews. In preparing to give this talk, I had the happy thought to look up the word critic in one of my favorite books, Mencken's New Dictionary of Quotations. Now, Mencken was a critic, a famous and important one, but he was also a man with a robust sense of humor and an equally robust sense of the absurd. So I thought it was a safe bet that under critic in his Dictionary of Quotations, I'd find some zingers, and sure enough, I did. One of them was from John Dryden. It goes like this: "They who write ill, and they who ne'er durst write, turn critics out of mere revenge and spite." I was also taken by this quatrain from Lord Byron's English Bards and Scotch Reviewers. "Fear not to lie, 'twill seem a lucky hit. Shrink not from blasphemy, 'twill pass for wit. Care not for feeling, pass your proper jest, and stand a critic, hated yet caressed." But the verse that really stuck in my craw was one that I didn't find under critic. Instead, it appeared under the name of the man who wrote it, Alexander Pope. "Yes, I am proud, I must be proud, to see men not afraid of God, afraid of me." Terrible words, aren't they? They say a great deal about Mr. Pope, and what they say I don't like. In fact, I would go so far as to suggest that they have the rank smell of pathology, that they speak of a man whose ego was badly twisted and who took it out on the people about whom he wrote. Well, I'm not going to try to tell you that they don't hit the target because, not surprisingly, I know a lot of critics, and some of them are just like that. A number of years ago, I was at a Manhattan dinner party, sitting next to a well-known New York music critic. I said to him, "What are you up to these days?" And he turned to me with a truly fearful smile, the kind of smile you could pick dead birds out of, as Randall Jarrell once put it. And I kid you not, he rubbed his hands together with glee and said to me, "I'm flying out to Los Angeles next week to pan an opera." And you know what? He did just that. I know a thing or two about the man who directed that particular opera, who, since I'm now in the opera business, will remain nameless. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it had, in fact, deserved the drubbing that my colleague gave it to. But what's wrong with this picture is that my dinner companion not only made up his mind in advance that it wasn't going to be any good, but was actually looking forward to saying so. The sad thing is that too many critics feel just that way about what they do. Not all of them, please note. Critics come in all shades. It's true that a music critic of the Chicago Tribune, a woman who had no training in music whatsoever, who began her career as a secretary at the Tribune, succeeded in running 3 music directors of the Chicago Symphony out of town and was proud of it. Her name was Claudia Cassidy, and it will live in infamy. But it is also true that a music critic was the prime mover, not a prime mover, but the prime mover, behind the founding of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra. Without him, that orchestra would not exist today. His name was John Ardoin, and it will live in whatever the opposite of infamy may be. I dare say, however, that more critics are like Claudia Cassidy than like John Ardoin. In fact, I will go a step further. Many critics at major American newspapers are incompetent, by which I mean they don't know enough about their chosen art form to responsibly pass judgment on the things they review. I'm sure there are more bad critics than bad directors. There might be more bad critics than bad conductors. And while I don't know which group wreaks more havoc, I do know that bad critics do more than their share. They make artists miserable, confuse audiences, and generally add to the sum total of unhappiness on this earth. Unfortunately, bad critics have always been with us and will always be with us. There is just no getting rid of them. Kill one and another will likely spring up in his place. How then do you make a good critic? I have a few ideas, not surprisingly, and I'd like to start by telling you what I think good criticism is. Mencken said it was prejudice made plausible. Now, I don't quite buy that, but I do note that he is stressing the personal element, and up to a point, I think he's right. Critics deal in opinions. They sell their opinions, if you like. Some of them actually have been known to sell their opinions, but that's another lecture. But pure opinion, uninflected and unenriched by knowledge and close observation, is pure drivel. Good criticism isn't just me spouting off. It's me looking and listening, paying the closest possible attention, and telling you what I see and hear. It is rooted, above all, in description and metaphor. A couple of years ago, I went to see Druids Sing, a marathon presentation in one day of the complete plays of John Millington Synge. In my Wall Street Journal review, I described the set as a fog-filled, dirt-floored hut whose dead gray walls stretch upward to infinity. If I do say so myself, I think I earned my pay that day. I also think I earned it when I came back from the Voisey inheritance and wrote that Fritz Weaver wraps his velvety voice around his lines as though he were stroking them with a mink glove. Creating that kind of imagery is not just a verbal trick. It is central to the art of criticism. Fairfield Porter, a great American painter who doubled as a superb art critic, put it simply and beautifully in a piece he wrote back in the 50s. This is what he said: Criticism creates an analogy, and by examining the analogy, you see what the art essentially is. Criticism should tell you what is there. That's exactly right. But you can't do it, I don't think, unless you really know what you're talking about, unless you have thought deeply about the art form you are criticizing. And I have come to believe in recent years that it is not enough to think. You must also do, or at least have done. It is not a popular view among my colleagues, but most of the best critics, not all, but most, have had at least some hands-on experience in the arts they criticize. Now, I've spent my entire adult life immersed in the world of art, not just as a critic, but also as a practitioner. When I was in college, I conducted orchestras and choirs, accompanied singers, played a recital, played in pit orchestras, and helped to prepare opera productions. I also acted in straight theater, worked as an assistant director, and painted more than my share of flats. Now, granted, none of this necessarily means I know what I'm talking about when I say the set was ugly and the soprano sang out of tune, but at the very least, it increases the chances of my being right. I was also fortunate to have served my apprenticeship as a critic in a middle-sized city, Kansas City, because it taught me that criticism is not written in a vacuum. It touches real people, people of flesh and blood, and sometimes it hurts them. If you don't know that, and I mean really know it, you shouldn't be a critic. And you're more likely to know it when you've lived and worked in a city small enough that there's a pretty good chance of your meeting the people you write about in intermission. Writing for the Kansas City Star taught me that lesson. It also taught me that critical standards have to be appropriate. You don't review a Zankel Hall recital by a debutante pianist the same way you review Alfred Brendel. That's another reason why critics should have hands-on experience in the areas about which they write. It teaches them proper respect for what Wilfred Sheed has called the simple miracle of getting the curtain up every night. It's hard to learn a Beethoven sonata by memory. It's scary to go out in front of 1,000 people and put your heart and soul on the line. Unless you have some personal experience of what that feels like, of the problems, both psychological and practical, that stand in the way of getting the curtain up, then you may err on the side of an unrealistic perfectionism, and your reviews will be sterile and uncomprehending as a result. Now, none of this is to say that criticism should be bland and toothless. Sometimes it's a critic's duty, his responsibility, to drop the big one. But he shouldn't enjoy it, not ever. And he should always make an effort to be modest when he's writing about people who can do something he can't, even when he doesn't think they do it very well. I wish I could tell you that I always live up to that standard, but the fact is that I don't. Sometimes I write in the heat of the moment and get carried away. I'm so passionate about music and theater that it makes me angry to see a great play or a great opera mangled, usually by a wrong-headed director. And when that happens, I can become intemperate and sometimes even downright nasty. This, of course, may be a matter of opinion. I don't really think it was nasty of me to say that The Times They Are A-Changin', a musical I reviewed last year, was, well, this is what I said. I said it was so bad that it makes you forget how good the songs are. But Twyla Tharp probably felt otherwise. I said that critics should be willing to admit their mistakes. I myself have done it more than once in print. And I actually wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal a few years ago called The Contrite Critic. The occasion for that column was a performance in New York of a dance by Mark Morris, the great modern dance choreographer, called L'Allegro, Il Penseroso ed il Moderato. The reason why I wrote the column was because, 7 years earlier, I had panned L'Allegro in my capacity as dance critic of the New York Daily News. I called it impressive in its seriousness, stunning in its inventiveness, and ultimately disappointing in its emotional flatness. I was, so far as I know, the only dance critic for a major publication ever to pan L'Allegro. I've written my share of wrong-headed reviews, but that's the one I regret most because I was too dense to know a masterpiece when I saw it for the first time. A few years later, I told one of Mark's dancers that while I admired his work greatly, I had somehow failed to connect with L'Allegro. Instead of bristling, she smiled and replied, "You'll experience it fully in the future, never fear." Time was when I might have bristled at so cocky a retort, but by then I already suspected that I was the one at fault, and I made my act of contrition when L'Allegro came to the Brooklyn Academy of Music in the spring of 2001. I wrote then in the Washington Post, "I didn't warm to the dance when I saw it at the Lincoln Center Festival 6 years ago. It struck me as virtuosic but empty. What was I thinking? L'Allegro is a whole world of dance in a single evening, everything from childlike pantomime to knockabout comedy to complex groupings reminiscent of George Balanchine in their control and clarity." I mention this because it is a good thing for critics to abase themselves in public, even though we do it so rarely. I've changed my mind about art more than once, and I've learned that I not infrequently start by disliking something and end up liking it. Not always. Sometimes I decide on closer acquaintance that a novel or a painting isn't as good as I had thought. More often, though, I realize that it was necessary for me to grow into a fuller understanding of a work of art to which my powers of comprehension were not at first equal. The music critic Hans Keller said something shrewd about this phenomenon. He said, "As soon as I detest something, I ask myself why I like it." I try to keep that in mind whenever I cover a premiere. I don't mean to say that critics should be wishy-washy, but we should also remember that strong emotions sometimes masquerade as their own opposite. Brooks Atkinson, for example, panned the original production of Rodgers and Hart's Pal Joey in the New York Times, calling it drab and mirthless. When he saw the 1952 revival, he knew he'd been wrong, and he said so in print. This is what he wrote. In 1940, Pal Joey was regarded as the musical that broke the old formula and brought the musical stage to maturity. There was a minority, including this column, that was not enchanted, but no one is likely now to be impervious to the tight organization of the production, the terseness of the writing, the liveliness and versatility of the score, and the easy perfection of the lyrics. Good for him. More common, alas, is the case of the great art critic Clement Greenberg. In 1945, Greenberg dismissed Monet's late paintings as mere instances of his style, but not works of art. 12 years later, he proclaimed their revolutionary significance, adding that the righting of a wrong is involved here, though that wrong, which was a failure in appreciation, may have been inevitable and even necessary at a certain stage in the evolution of modern painting. Excuse me? That's like a politician saying, mistakes were made instead of, I blew it. Now, I yield to no one in my admiration for Clem Greenberg, but I also think the world of art would be a better place if we critics made a point of eating crow from time to time. As for me, as I mentioned a moment ago, not only have I changed my mind about art more than once, but I've learned sometimes I start out by disliking a piece and end up liking it. That's what happened the first time I heard the music of Dmitri Shostakovich many years ago. I didn't get it at first, and now I love it with all my heart, in part because I've heard so much of it and have had the chance to get on the composer's wavelength. And that's the problem with newspaper criticism. It's written on a deadline, after one hearing of a work that may have taken a year or two to write. This, too, suggests the need for a certain modesty on the part of the critic, as well as the audience. Moss Hart, George Kaufman's collaborator, who knew a thing or two about the world of theater, said something very wise in his autobiography. He claimed that every audience is willing to give every play 15 minutes before making up its mind. He wrote, "In the first 15 minutes of a play, the audience is the most malleable group in the world. Give them the slightest token that they are going to be entertained or moved, and they become a receptive instrument that both playwright and actors can play upon at will. Then a curious thing happens. Somehow, at the end of that first 15 minutes, an invisible bell seems to ring in the theater, and if the play has not captured them by then en masse, they become a disparate group of people who are never welded together again. One can almost feel the moment when it arrives, and the inner ear can hear that bell tolling soundlessly." Have you noticed that? I have, time and again. Well, too bad critics can't take 15 days to make up their minds, or 15 weeks. And too bad we don't have time to go back and hear new pieces at least twice, if not 15 times, before reviewing them. I started writing criticism when I was 21 years old, way too young, and I'd give a lot to take back some of the things I wrote back then. I remember how shocked I was when I read a book about doctors that pointed out, very matter-of-factly, that every intern kills a few patients from ignorance or inattention or simply not having gotten enough sleep the night before. The trouble is that there's no other way for him to learn how to be a doctor. He has to do it, right or wrong. I'm afraid I killed a few patients when I was in my early 20s, and I wish I hadn't. But I think I learned from the experience, just as I learned more than I can possibly say from the experience of having gotten up in front of an audience and given them a chance to clap or hiss. Now, it so happens, as Paul told you, that I write about all the arts. And judged by the standards I've been laying down this afternoon, I probably have no business writing about some of them. For example, I am a dance amateur with no training whatsoever. Didn't even go to my senior prom. Yet my last book was a biography of George Balanchine, the greatest choreographer of the 20th century. Well, because of my experience in music and drama, I think I understand and respect the miracle of getting the curtain up, as well as some deeper things about dance as an art form. But I came to dance as an adult, and my first pieces about ballet must have sounded like a teenager running around shouting, "I'm in love! Isn't it great? Why aren't you in love too?" I do think that kind of enthusiasm makes up for a certain amount of ignorance, so long as you quickly get down to the business of learning what you don't know, which I did and am still doing. Every critic should be modest in the face of the things he doesn't know. I just used the word love. That's no accident. I love art, and I love my work. I think I have the best job in the world. I don't love the act of writing. Few writers do, which is why so many of them are alcoholics. But I love everything else about what I do. For one thing, I love my work because I think I'm fulfilling a necessary and valuable function. I mentioned Clement Greenberg a few moments ago, and I gave him a bit of stick, but in fact, I admire his work greatly. And here's something else that Greenberg once wrote that is very much to the point. One of the wonderful things about art is that everybody has to discover the criteria of quality for himself. They can't be communicated by word or demonstration. You have to find out for yourself by looking and experiencing. And the people who try hardest and look hardest end up, over the ages, by agreeing with one another in the main. That I call the consensus of taste. I think that helping to shape this consensus and to speed its creation is a highly honorable pursuit, one that, when done well, is good for the world of art. I think of myself as a kind of advance agent for posterity, someone who tries to make sure that people get their just desserts now, not when they're 80 or dead. That's why there's nothing I like better, nothing in the world, than going to see something good and writing about it. The awful truth is that I don't really like writing bad reviews. I can't understand critics who live to write stinkers. Why on earth would anybody want to sit through a bad performance just so he could write about it? I have better things to do with my evenings. And when I go to a performance, I always side with the performers, at least at first. When things go wrong with an opera or a play, I feel for the people on stage and backstage, unless I have personal knowledge that they're dreadful people who deserve to crash and burn, which does occasionally happen in this business. For the most part, though, I think we're all on the same side, performers and critics alike, and if I'm a good critic, it's because I believe this to be so. There is a beautiful line from Pride and Prejudice that I take as my critical motto. I hope I never ridicule what is wise or good. I used to teach a college course in criticism, and on the first day I always gave my students a handout called The 15 Commandments of a Critic. Now, some of them were just simple horse sense. Be simple, be brief, be specific, wear a watch. But the last three bear on what I've been talking about. They are: always treat artists with respect. Most of them know how to do something you can't do. Don't be afraid to be wrong. And last, but very definitely not least, don't be afraid to be enthusiastic. That's what I think criticism should do at its best. It is about enthusiasm and passion and love, and if it's not about those things, then it's no good. I've panned a lot of shows since becoming the Wall Street Journal's drama critic 5 years ago, and I'm sure I'll pan a lot more. But if you were to ask me to name the review of which I'm the proudest, I'd probably point to what I wrote about the Broadway revival of a great play by the Irish playwright Brian Friel called Faith Healer. This is how that review ended. This revival is making an overwhelmingly powerful impression on the audiences who see it, as well it should. For my part, I came away humbled by the collective mastery of the artists who are bringing Faith Healer to blazing life each night. Gifted as they are, though, it is Brian Friel who deserves the highest praise of all. Once again, he has proved art's power to narrow the fearful gap that separates soul from soul. Like every great writer, he reveals us to one another and to ourselves. That's the best part of my job, and the part that matters most, to ring the bell for greatness, whether I find it on Broadway, in Carnegie Hall, or any tiny theater halfway across the country. I don't claim to be a perfect critic, but I will claim this much. I've never in my life been afraid to be enthusiastic, and I hope I never will. Now, we thought I would take some questions, and I think Paul wants to start the ball rolling.
I hope we give you some time to think of questions, because we have some time here. And as you can tell, Terry is a talker, so he can answer. I had the experience of sitting with Terry at what do you call it, press preview of Sweeney Todd, the movie, in early December. It's like December 3rd or something. And so we were sitting there in this big, huge theater, and Sondheim got up and introduced it, and Tim Burton and Johnny Depp came out, and they, introduced it and so on. And you were thrilled. I mean, sitting next to you. Now we're writing this opera together, and Sweeney Todd is a model for us. I mean, we're very interested in the problems technically that Sondheim solves in the musical and so on. So I had the experience of sitting next to Terry, but he was in a dual role as a critic who needed to write, I guess, on deadline to some extent for the journal, I guess, and as a creator who was taking mental notes and thinking, "Ooh, we gotta nail that mark," and so on.
You remember when I tapped you on the shoulder and said, "Don't forget that, we didn't steal that"?
So tell us about that. What's that like to be?
Well, I actually find myself in an interesting position now that I'm collaborating with Paul on the libretto of our opera, The Letter. This is not something I've ever done. I did write a play once, which is in my desk drawer, which is where it belongs and where it will remain. It wasn't any good. But writing it, this was before I was a drama critic, actually, writing it taught me things about what I was going to be doing, though I didn't know it at the time, that I really couldn't have learned any other way. And then, in the 5 years or so since that experience, I've sat on the aisle every week and seen 2 or 3 shows pretty much every week in the last 5 years. And although it wasn't until, it was about 2 years ago that we realized that we were going to do this opera. I didn't know that I was going to become an opera librettist, but I was getting, though I didn't know it, the best possible training for that experience. Because I was being forced to think analytically about how shows work. And you learn as much from seeing a bad one as you do from a good one. And if you see that many shows over a relatively compact period of time, you get a sense for what works on a stage. Theater is the ultimate empirical art form. It is entirely about what works. It's about more than that, obviously. I mean, Hamlet is more than just a really effective piece of theater. It's also a great piece of literature. But it works on stage, and there are reasons why it works. And when you see playwrights bellying up to the bar 2 or 3 times a week and facing the test of getting in front of an audience and starting the 15-minute clock and holding their attention or not holding their attention. Well, if you don't learn something from that experience, you know, you're really absolutely in the wrong business. So by the time Paul and I settled into the task of trying to figure out what an opera would be and how we would write it, and my part came first, we discussed it, and then I wrote the words for it. I had learned a lot about what not to do. And watching Sweeney Todd, knowing that I was going to be writing in some detail, I wrote a fairly long essay about it actually in the current issue of Commentary. I was, at the same time, I was immersed in the experience because a movie and an opera have in common that they're both enveloping experiences. You know, they seem to take up all of the senses. And I was carried away, and yet at the back of my head was the sentry who's always on duty, who was saying to me, "Oh, Lord, I wish I'd had a week to coach Johnny Depp into how to sing that part," you know. Because you can have these things at the same time. You must have them at the same time. You must have the experience that the audience has, if it's there, which is the experience of being swept away, and also the experience of thinking about how it's happening and why it's happening, and maybe how you'd like to do that differently or how you don't quite think it works. And I know that you must have a similar experience when you're listening to a new piece of music because you're in the racket. You know, you must be thinking, how would I do that differently? Composers make interesting critics, not always reliable ones, because they're bringing themselves entirely to the table. And you have to make this great allowance for the fact that they write music the way they want music to be written, and so they think that other music ought to be written like that too. But because they know where the nuts and bolts and seams are, everything they write and say about a piece of music, everything that a playwright writes and says about a play is worth knowing whether it's right or wrong. That's why George Bernard Shaw was such a good drama critic, because he knew how to write a play. And that's what I was getting at a few minutes ago when I said I really think critics, if at all possible, ought to have some professional hands-on experience in the things that they write about. There's just no other way to learn. None that I can see. Yes, sir. Well, I'll start by telling you what Sondheim says. He came out that night that Paul was talking about and said, "Forget what you know. This isn't a stage musical. It's not a film of a stage musical. It is an original creation that is based on this source material, but we have done something completely different with it." And I think he was right to say that. I don't think he was just making noise. I think he was absolutely serious about that, and I think that the result was, this is what I said in Commentary, the best film ever made of a Broadway musical, without exception, including Cabaret, which previously I would have said was the mark. And a big part of the reason why it's good, and look up my piece if you want to know the specifics of it, but a good part of the reason why it's good is precisely because it is not afraid to get away from the stage model, to do things differently, to remove the presentational element that works on stage but not in a movie theater. And I think it's amazing that Sondheim, who's not a young man and who is deeply vested in this work, which I think is the greatest thing he's ever created, was willing to come to it fresh and say, okay, how do we make this work as a film? That's quite an achievement. Quite an achievement. I've seen a lot of productions of Sweeney Todd, too. It's one of the pieces that I seek out. And I won't say it's hard to do badly, but most of the productions I've seen have been good. That's just because it's it's almost bulletproof, almost bulletproof. But the film is remarkable. If you know the stage version well, you have to come to it fresh. But it's really quite something, I think. And read the new issue of Commentary for more details. Yes, sir.
The question about the craft,
Ah. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes, for everybody's information, I write a column every Friday in the Journal. That's where my theater reviews appear. Well, there's some critics whose work I avoid for other reasons. No. No, I really don't, and I'll tell you why. Because experience has taught me that, for whatever reason, I'm not subject to this steering from other people. Maybe it's just that I'm not young anymore, and I have figured out that if I have anything to offer, it's what I think, not what somebody else thinks. But I don't find that reading what somebody else has said about a work colors what I think about it. This is not my experience. I don't really care what other people think. There are a couple of critics that I'm very interested in what they think because they're really good. Because years of experience have taught me that they know and they see and they should always be taken seriously. And there are critics who, if I don't like something and they do, I'll think twice, but I won't change what I wrote. I really won't do that. The one thing that you can't do is fake a response, because as soon as you do that, your work turns to dust. You can change your mind, as I said in my talk. I've done that before. You can be brought to enlightenment, but I'm certainly not going to be brought to enlightenment because in the morning that I'm writing my review, I read what Critic X said in the New York X. That's just not going to happen. Well, I don't. I'm doctorate free. I don't even have a master's degree. I'm quite innocent in that respect. Back row, sir. It depends on you. I mean, of course, it is all subjective. It's not. That's not literally true. It is not a matter of opinion whether somebody sings out of tune. There are things about the act of criticism that either you know it or you don't, and if you don't know it, you shouldn't be doing it. But beyond that, we like to think that we're right. I think I'm right. If I didn't think I was right, I wouldn't do this. But it is subjective, and I accept that. I wish I could know more about works of art about the process that goes into them. I mean, we can't go to rehearsals. It's just not done. We wouldn't be allowed to do that. We're not trusted, for better or worse. That's just the way it is. And newspapers like the Wall Street Journal are very particular about you're writing about people with whom you have personal relationships. I cannot write about Paul as a critic in the Wall Street Journal, nor should I. But, well, I'll tell you what my experience is. You know, I've done this long enough. I'm 52 years old. I have a pretty fair idea of what I'm in for, maybe 2/3 of the time when I go to a theater, because it's a playwright whose work I know, or a director whose work I know, or I've heard the buzz, which is really quite accurate in the New York theater world. And when I walk into the theater, you know, I have a sense of what's likely to happen. But I switch it off when the curtain goes up. And the reason why I know that I really do this is because I am capable of being surprised. It's happened to me a fair amount. I have been surprised both ways by shows I expected to love and hated, and vice versa. I have seen plays which at the intermission I thought I was going to pan, and when I went home I gave a good review to. The most spectacular example of that was a play by Martin McDonagh called The Pillow Man. I went to it with a person who was a great fan of McDonagh's, a theater person, and at the intermission we were both just looking at ourselves saying, what the hell is that about? And an hour later we thought it was one of the best things we'd ever seen. So because I know I can be surprised, I'm not afraid to let myself feel grumpy when I go into the theater and say, oh hell, another Philip Glass premiere, or whatever it is. Well, I don't think I'm going to change my mind about him at this point, but I know I'm capable of being surprised. I am, when I go into a theater, I'm really paying attention to what's happening in front of me rather than what I think is going to happen. And I trust myself on that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned George Bernard Shaw, whose criticism I much admire, and you mentioned that the playwright who knew something about plays, but as I'm sure you all know, he was a fantastic music critic. And so I wonder whether you could say something about the extent to which his experience as a playwright and a writer actually helps in doing music criticism, because you yourself review so many different kinds of art forms. In a way, I find Shaw even more impressive as a music critic
I agree with you.
than as a critic of drama.
I agree with you. Well, all right, to look at Shaw's resume, he started out as a music critic. And before that, he did actually have not really professional experience as a musician, but a considerable amount of hands-on experience. He taught himself how to play piano. He was capable of taking the piano score of an opera or symphony, and at a time when there were no phonograph records, being able to get through his playing the sense of what it sounded like. He worked with singers. He'd actually, I think he had studied singing, if I remember correctly. So he wasn't a babe in the woods. Yeah, yeah.
Trots out a certain number of rather trying details of harmonization, and then says, there, I've done it, and I don't
Right.
know what I'm doing.
Well, as they say in the boxing business, he knew his onions. But it's what you're asking me as it relates to me. It's interesting, and I think about it a lot. I am a musician. That was the first art form that I engaged with, and it's the first one that I wrote about. But from the beginning, I'd always been a writer. I taught myself how to hunt and peck on my parents' typewriter, and I was one of those kids who made up his own newspaper when he was a little boy, that kind of stuff. And somewhere along the way, it occurred to me that these weren't parallel tracks, that they could be the same track, that I could write about the things that interested me, what I loved most, which was art. And that was how I ended up being a critic. But somehow I always thought that it was possible to write about what interested me, even though I wasn't necessarily a specialist in it. I discovered dance as an adult, and the second thing I thought after, oh my God, why didn't somebody tell me about this years ago, was I want to write about this. Writing about things is a way of learning about them, because you have to articulate in words what you are feeling, and that reifies the sensations, and it teaches you. R.P. Blackmer said, all knowledge is a descent from the paradise of undifferentiated sensation. That's how it goes. All knowledge is a descent from the paradise of undifferentiated sensation. Isn't that beautiful? That's exactly what it is. You know, when I first went to the ballet, I remember it very well. I actually wrote about this. It's the beginning of my book about George Balanchine. I knew who he was. I had seen a documentary about him. I thought, I've got to get some of this. And I bought a ticket to New York City Ballet, and the first thing on the program was Concerto Barocco, which is a ballet to the Bach D minor, the two-violin concerto. And it really did hit me like an arrow in the forehead. And that first time, did I understand in any analytic way what I was seeing? No. It was undifferentiated sensation that was coming at me. And the more I saw this, I don't know how many times I've seen Barocco, and I couldn't count the number of times I've seen Balanchine ballets. The more I learned, the more I saw. And I'm glad I learned, and I'm glad I learned how to articulate it. But there is something to be said for being carried away and not knowing anything, you know? There really is. That's the paradise of undifferentiated sensation that Blackmer's talking about. So I'm out of that paradise now, and I...
Do I hear you saying that first and foremost, from the beginning, you're writing, and then you found these creative...
Yeah, well, I started playing music when I was in 6th grade, and I had been listening to it for a few years before that. There was music in the house. But I was writing as soon as I got my hands on a typewriter. It was all one big process for me.
The best music criticism I know is as stylistically perfect as it is in its judgment.
Well, you want it to be artful, you know? Yeah, Shaw's artful. Yeah. I guess, I mean, somebody who gets everything right and doesn't write well, okay, they're on the side of the angels, but they're no fun to read, and they're probably not going to be read a century from now. I mentioned Brooks Atkinson in my talk, who was the New York Times' drama critic, and he was a really serious, thoughtful, an amateur of drama, but he took his job seriously. He wasn't a great writer. And as a result, his works were not collected. He's not really remembered as a writer. But I go back to Atkinson's reviews of plays that were premiered on Broadway. He was at the first performance of Our Town, for example. And I almost always find that he has something interesting to say, something that I find valuable. But he does not say it in a way that one typically finds memorable. Whereas Mary McCarthy, who was utterly perverse as a drama critic, was also a wonderful writer. And so you read her with great interest, but you take her with a cellar of salt, you know. You can't separate the two things. But, you know, all things being equal, one ought to write well. It's a virtue. Wendy. Read the play. Sometimes, if it's accessible. I'm interested in what scholars call reception history. And, you know, when I became the Journal's drama critic 5 years ago, I had not been a working drama critic. I'd seen a bunch of plays, but I had never, this is not something I'd done for a living. And I really got interested in drama criticism as a genre. I mean, I'd read Shaw because one reads Shaw, that's part of being literate. But I also looked up older critics like Stark Young, who wrote for the New Republic and was maybe the best American drama critic. And I will look at what has been written about important works that I am seeing for the first time. But when I get into the seat on the aisle, you have to put all that in the box. And Robert Warshaw, a film critic whom I admire very greatly, talked about how what mattered was the immediate experience of art. And I try never to let anything get in the way of the immediate experience. Afterwards, I start thinking about what I know, and I bring that to it, and, you know, there comes out of that something worthwhile, I hope. But the most important thing is being in the seat, looking at the stage with your eyes open, and everything else pales next to that. Yes, ma'am. Well, I have some experience with that. Elliot Feld, a choreographer I like, has made a lot of dances to the music of Steve Reich, a composer whom basically I don't really like. But I found, watching them, that the music works for the intended purpose. In fact, I thought that was its intended purpose, even though he didn't know what it was. Just like Philip Glass's music works quite well when used as background music for films, because there is no foreground. The events are not specific enough to hold my attention if nothing is coming at me but the music. But they can work quite well for other purposes. And you know, if the bad music makes the choreographer make a good ballet, then there was something in it. That doesn't mean that I want to go home and hear it divorced from the visual experience. But yes, there have been dances where the music is just so awful that I want to hide under the seat. And there have been dances where it was played so badly that I wanted to do the same thing. You know, Merce Cunningham makes dances without reference to the music that is accompanying them. He tells the composer, I want 33 minutes. And then they happen at the same time. And I used to joke that because the scores that tend to accompany those dances, he went through a period where they were all awful, loud, ugly, random electronic music. And I said to myself, according to Merce's theories, I should be able just to bring my Walkman and my headphones. And all my fellow dance critics said, oh, no, can't do that. Well, I just read in the paper the other day that Merce is making a dance where he expects you to bring your iPod. He's caught up with me. Good for him. He's not too old to learn. I'm not watching the clock. Any other questions? Wendy? Paul? The Moravecs? In whatever order they wish. Do you all know what a blog is? I have to ask that. I am actually the first print media art critic to start a blog. About last night, Teachout.com was about 2 weeks ahead of anybody else. So I'm a groundbreaking pioneer in the field of art blogging. I stand before you, a pathbreaker. I use the blog as a kind of public notebook. I use it for a lot of things, but relative to what you're talking about, the way I use it is to try things out, because it is informal. I can write and publish in a single act. And so when I put something up on the blog, that's why we called it About Last Night. I can just say what I thought immediately. Maybe about something that I'm not planning to write a full-scale piece about, maybe about something that I plan to re-experience. The one thing I don't do is I don't write about plays before I review them for the journal, because that's part of my deal. But with everything else, I use it as a way of trying ideas out. This quotation has been so widely attributed that I don't really know who said it, but somebody once said, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" And blogging is a good tool in that ongoing process. Wendy? Oh, yes, sir.
Having retired 25 years ago from the book business, where changes have been made to the newspapers and magazines, I'm sure you're aware, I see a lot of coverage. I see a lot of huge sales of books, general trade books, and I know it's because of the big bookstores and such. It is not because of the newspapers, which have cut out their book sections. I remember the San Francisco Chronicle book section, the Washington Post book section. Many others no longer exist, and so there's very little coverage in general books and newspapers as they used to. Maybe that's because of the conglomeration. You better have the bottom line, a net profit, and so you cut out book reviewing because you don't get book advertising. But is this likely to happen in other fields? Can you compare? I used to be saddened by authors telling me that why does the New York Times give to review to another first novelist. You know, this happened more than once, as I'm sure you know.
At the Times, that's called horses for courses.
But, you know, I just wonder if the future of drama and art and music and newspaper coverage to reach the people who still read newspapers is going to suffer. Blogs may take their place.
They are to some extent already doing that. There are, well, if you go to my blog and you look at the right-hand column of the blog is what's called a blog roll. It's a list of links to blogs organized by category. And I think now we have something like 25 blogs basically about literary subjects that are publishing very lively and interesting criticism, and it is starting to drive sales of literary books. I mean, not mass market books, but books for which an additional sale of 300 or 400 copies is a rather big deal. I think, I've said this before, that the future of serious arts criticism is to migrate to the web, which is what newspapers themselves are doing. This is not official. I don't have Rupert Murdoch's ear. But I think the Wall Street Journal will not have a paper edition 10 years from now. We are already, our online edition, which you have to pay to see, is the 4th largest newspaper in terms of circulation in the country. I believe that's right. And I think that that's what's going to happen. Newspapers there will be something like what we now call a newspaper, but you will read it in another way, on another device. And I don't have a problem with that. I really don't. I don't read the Wall Street Journal on paper. I haven't read it on paper for 3 years. The only copy of the Journal I bought in the last 3 years was when I started writing a column for the Saturday paper, and they put in a woodcut of my portrait, and I bought it to see what it looked like. It's awful. Fortunately, they don't have it on the online edition. Yet another reason to read the Journal on your computer. But I think, by and large, that the web has been a good thing for criticism, broadly understood, because it has enabled a fast-growing number of people to become critics who are amateurs in the old-fashioned sense of that word, the original etymological meaning of the word. People who love an art form are not professional journalists, but very often, alarmingly often, have more to say about it than the people who get paid to write about it. But in the short run, there isn't going to be a lot of book reviewing in newspapers in the next 5 years. There is not going to be a lot of the age of the local movie reviewer is over. They're being fired right and left. I'm safe because we're a national newspaper, and because I'm a national critic. I'm actually flying to California tomorrow morning to review 6 shows in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And the live arts, the live and lively arts, they profit from newspaper criticism in a way that other art forms might not necessarily. I mean, it's just a different thing. But eventually, newspapers themselves are going to consolidate. Most of them will be on the web. There will be a half-dozen national newspapers, and that's where the bulk of the arts writing, I think, is going to be. But there'll probably always be classical music critics in major city newspapers because the local orchestra is a civic thing. It's important to the community in a way that a novel that was published in New York is not necessarily important to the community, if you see what I mean. So I think that's the direction it's going to go. I do think that. Yes, sir. I agree with you. Well, I mean, one possible way to answer that question is it depends on who's doing it. Sweeney Todd can be performed and is performed by opera companies. Schuyler Chapin, after he saw the opening of it, said to Hal Prince, "You should have brought this to me." This was when Chapin was running the Metropolitan Opera. He said, "You should have brought it to me. We would have done this." And they would have been right to do it. Light in the Piazza is as close to an opera as doesn't matter. I mean, in terms of its seriousness of musical language. Yeah. But Sondheim, I think, I mean, I don't know Sondheim personally. Paul does. I don't. I think he has a nostalgic attachment to the world of theater in which he grew up. That's half of it. The other half is he really doesn't like opera singers because when he was young, they couldn't act. Well, I got news for him that a lot of them can act now, and we're going to be proving that in Santa Fe in a year. Yeah, that's right. To me, the big problem with musical productions of good musicals today is that they're undersung. You can do Sweeney Todd with second-rate singers. I mean, in a sense, that's what the film does. But it just doesn't have the right effect. And I'm pleasantly surprised by the number of opera houses that are attempting to do Sondheim's pieces, mostly Sweeney Todd and A Little Night Music, which are the ones that seem to fit the best. I was afraid that Sondheim's work would not have a revival life, good as it is, because it's just too serious. I mean, he's only had, I think, 2 shows that have made a profit on Broadway. A Little Night Music made its investment back, and A Funny Thing Happened at the Forum made its investment back. And it's the original production Sweeney Todd did, but the rest all lost money. But they're getting revived. I think we're seeing a transformation of musical comedy. People who are influenced by Sondheim are trying to create a new kind of hybrid work that has the seriousness, the musical weight and seriousness of opera, but whose language is not primarily operatic. And Adam Gettle, who wrote Light in the Piazza, and Floyd Collins well, I write the headlines for most of my Wall Street Journal pieces, and when I reviewed The Light in the Piazza, the headline I wrote was Sondheim's Air. That's really what I think. It's an interesting time to be working in that field. It is also an interesting time to be writing an opera, because opera is one of the few high culture media that is more popular today than it was 15, 20 years ago. It's the only growth stock in classical music, and so we're getting into it at a good time. We're trying. Paul mentioned that what we're doing in the letter is informed by Sweeney Todd. Our opera. We expect it to be 90 minutes long, and it won't have an intermission. And it's an opera. It's not a musical. There's absolutely no question about that. But we are trying to have the speed and impact and force of a film or a musical like Sweeney Todd. We want it to go, well, Paul always says like an express train. That's the metaphor he uses. And Sweeney Todd has that kind of speed and impact. So even though it's not a musical that we're writing, I think that it will profit from what we think is good about that medium. It's going to have a lot more harmonic density. Like I say, it's really an opera. Broadway singers won't be able to perform it, but we hope it'll have that kind of punch. You watching the clock, Paul? I'm not. I could talk all day, as I'm sure you realize, but okay. Who wants to cap it? I just finished drawing up my schedule for October. It's subject to change. Broadway shows do not announce their press dates until usually about a month before the show opens. But we know when we know when most of them are opening. The problem with Broadway is there are only so many Broadway theaters, and that's what dictates how many shows can open in a year. the most number of shows that open on Broadway, the big months for me are March and April, going up to the cutoff deadline for the Tony Award nominations. So in March and April, I usually don't get out of town. I've generally got a couple or 3 Broadway openings a week during that period. On May 4th, or whatever the day is when the nominations come, it's like somebody turns the switch, and that's when I jump on the plane and start hitting the summer festivals. And right now, in January, is when I decide what I'm going to be seeing in the summer, because at that point, most of the major festivals are starting to make their season announcements, and it's very complicated doing this planning. We give Broadway precedence. Broadway is America's theater destination, and so I do review all Broadway openings. But other than that, the Journal will let me review anything I want, anywhere I want in the United States, so long as I get back in time to do Broadway openings, and I take advantage of that. I'm usually traveling every other week other than in March and April. So this year, oh Lord, I'm going to San Diego. I can't even remember where all the places I'm going, but right now I'm planned into October, subject to change. So I spend a lot of time working with my calendar. Wendy, your family, so you get to sneak in one more.
How often is it that the best thing you saw, best theater piece you saw is a regional theater?
2 times out of 3. Regional theater in the United States is identical in quality to the best things that you will see in New York. Another way to put this is to say that New York is just another region. There isn't as much of it. There's as much theater in Chicago as there is in New York. There's as much theater in Washington, D.C. There's as much in Los Angeles. There's almost as much in Minneapolis, almost as much in Atlanta. I am the only drama critic in America who covers regional theater all over the United States. And so I can say with more authority than anybody else covering theater how good American regional theater is. And the answer is the best of it is absolutely first rate. Last week I reviewed a Two River Theater Company in Red Bank, New Jersey, is doing a production of Macbeth, co-directed by Teller of Penn and Teller. That show, I would say that show belongs on Broadway, but I don't use that language anymore because that's not really a consideration. You should go to Two River and see it, or go to Washington, where it's going to be showing at the Folger Theater starting in April, I think. There's just no difference, Wendy. There's really no difference. There's more money on Broadway. So if you want to see flying chandeliers or whatever it is in that line, probably you're going to need to go to Broadway to see that. But I must say, if I want to see flying chandeliers, I'll just have an extra drink. So support your local regional theater and opera companies, please. Thanks very much.